My first UK conference in the last couple of years. I'm sure it's the same for many others who are with us today. And it's wonderful to be here in person, especially when we're talking about people. And I will be talking in this session about the human nature of cybersecurity, why people are so important to this field. A little aside of why people are not the weakest link. Happy to chat with anyone about that over coffee later as well. It wasn't planned to be part of my narrative, but I'm going to weave it in a little bit because I think it's important. Really what I'm focusing on is the importance of culture. We've heard a lot in the last couple of years about security culture, and I want to talk about what we really mean by security culture, what it is, and how we can more positively influence security culture in organizations. So you've already heard a very nice introduction from Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. So I won't dwell on this. But I've been working with people and security for about 10 or 11 years, working on awareness, behavior, and culture with all sorts of organizations around the world. Over that time, I've seen a really interesting shift. When I first started in the industry, and I would be at events like this, and people would say, hey, what do you do? And I'd say, oh, I work with people. I work on the human side of cybersecurity. And that would often not really resonate with the people I was speaking with. They wouldn't really know quite what that meant. And we've seen a huge change in that the last couple of years, much more emphasis on people. I think we've still got a way to go, but it's great to see how the profession has moved more towards embracing understanding people and how we can empower and enable people with security. So people, why people? Well, of course, we can't talk about security and not talk about people. People are involved at every stage of the technology or information lifecycle. So this is one reason why I don't find it accurate to say people are the weakest link, because people are every link when it comes to security. We would not have technology, we would not have information, we would not have security if we did not have people. So of course we have people involved in the design, in the development, in the delivery, in the testing, the use, the abuse, the destruction of information and technology. And of course people are incredibly impacted when it comes to the outfall of security or insecurity. So really saying people are the weakest link for me is not accurate, because people, we wouldn't have security, we wouldn't have cybersecurity, we wouldn't have technology or information if we didn't have people. And of course, for that one time that somebody maybe makes a mistake when it comes to security, there have been hundreds, if not thousands of times where they have done the right thing. So we don't talk about them being the strongest link there. We pick on the one time that maybe something goes wrong. And we don't generally look at the system and what's happened around it, how the technology's been configured. We generally will blame people, often referred to as the users. So people are inherent in this, and we can't really separate people out. But for decades we did. For decades in the security industry, we focused very much on technology. And we still do, don't we? We still very much focus heavily on technology rather than people. And for me, this is where I think we're making some mistakes, and this is why I think we're leaving people behind and leaving people more vulnerable. Which is why, of course, we've seen people be targeted more. So everybody will know, of course, these statistics from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. I don't want to reel them off now. But of course, Verizon in 2021 focused a little bit more on people than they had before. They had a shout out to security culture for the first time, talked a little bit about what that meant and how they defined it. And of course, they said phishing is still the top vector, and it grew over the year before. I find the first stat interesting. 85% of breaches had a human element. I'm going to take a nod from Jeff and ask you all to raise your hands. It's a very clever way of doing it. So if everybody could raise their hands, anybody who thinks that's high, would you put your hands down? Okay, so we all agree, 85%. Do people think it's actually higher than that? If you do, put your hand down. So what I'm waiting for is for somebody to explain, you can put your hands down, thanks so much. I'm waiting for somebody to explain the remaining 15%. What breach does not have a human element? I guess technically it must be how Verizon define the human element. But if someone over coffee today, or someone over LinkedIn if you're virtual, or Twitter, or whatever it might be, if you can tell me and we agree on a breach that doesn't have a human element, I've got a Kit Kat Chunky in my bag and you can have it. And I love Kit Kat, right? I love Kit Kat Chunkies, but you can have it because so far no one can tell me. I can't think of a breach that doesn't have a human element. There's humans attacking humans via technology one way or another. Right? So maybe Verizon can clear it up for me. Maybe somebody here today can tell me about a true AI attack, attacking true AI, and no people being involved at all. Still, I reckon that's got a human element, but okay. So people of course are central when it comes to cyber security. And one of those most impactful growing areas, as we saw Verizon mention, is around phishing. Of course, social engineering has been a huge problem for a very long time, well, all of humankind. But when we think about cybersecurity, social engineering has been a growing problem for many years. And I would say grew over the pandemic so far. Why does social engineering work? Well, we can look to behavioral economics to explain this. We can look at how we process information as human beings. Anybody who has read around behavioral economics will have read about system 1 and system 2 thinking, or thinking fast and thinking slow. Essentially, we have two ways of processing information in our brains. We either process information in a quick way or in a slow way. Or, as the book Nudge explains it, we process information in a rational, careful, considered way, like Spock, or we process information in a quick, emotional, impulsive way, like Homer. And usually we default to that quick way because we have to make, according to research, 36,000 decisions a day as a human being on an average day. So we have to make these quick decisions to get through life. But in making those quick decisions, we're often not relying on thinking about consequences of them. We're relying on impulse, relying on emotion. We're thinking quickly. Often, thinking quickly helps us, but sometimes it doesn't. And it also means that we can be manipulated. So what cyber criminals do when they socially engineer us is they will use tried and tested psychological techniques to push us into thinking more like Homer than Spock. So they will push us into thinking quickly because we know that there are certain triggers that can be used to make us all more likely to act before we think. One of those, of course, is fear. So fear is a tricky thing when it comes to cybersecurity, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later on. Because when cyber criminals use fear, unfortunately, it works well for them. When cyber criminals use fear, what they do is they push us into a quick way of thinking, they make us emotional, and fear is really good at encouraging a knee-jerk instinctive response. So that's why we saw, of course, so many of these emails, particularly when the pandemic started. Of course, we see them still around different elements of the pandemic, essentially relying and preying on our fear. So, of course, with COVID-19, most of us very anxious, wanting more information. We're worried about our health, we're worried about our family's health, we're worried about finances, job security, all sorts of things. This means our emotions are heightened. So we're going through day to day more in that quick way of thinking. We're more reactive, we're more like Homer anyway. And then we have phishing emails or texts or phone calls, whatever they may be. They come in and they're preying on this fear, they're preying on this situation. And so we are already in a heightened state of emotional response. Then we get something that makes us even more emotional, and we're far more likely to click the link, download the attachment, give over the money, the information, whatever it may be. Of course, social engineering also takes advantage of trust. It subverts trust. And we've been in a very interesting relationship with trust, again, over the pandemic. Almost overnight, when COVID-19 really started to hit around the world, our relationship with trust shifted. We went from having a natural trust in the physical world to suddenly questioning the physical world more than we ever had. washing our groceries, wearing masks, hand sanitizing, not knowing what we could touch. We were suddenly really much more fearful about the physical world than most of us would have been before. And at the same time, we were propelled into trusting the digital world more. We were having religious ceremonies on Zoom, pub quizzes on Zoom, people who weren't using technology to communicate in that way, whether at work or at home, suddenly were having to trust it more. Organizations were going through a forced digital transformation. Their plans to move maybe more to the cloud, to move people to remote working, that they maybe had for a year, 2, 3, 5 years, suddenly they had to enact them in a couple of days, a week or so. So we had this subversion of trust that, again, social engineering preyed on. And this is where culture really comes in. Again, we've had a very interesting time when it's come to security culture, because organizations were kind of already starting to think about it, starting to work on it a little bit before the pandemic. But what I've seen, certainly with the organizations we work with at Cygenta, is that there's been much more focus on security culture since we have moved to a more hybrid, or we're moving more towards a hybrid way of working. And this is backed up by the research. For example, ClubCISO, as you heard Jeff say, I was the chair of ClubCISO for a couple of years. We now have a membership of over 600 senior information security leaders, and I still serve on the advisory board. Every year at ClubCISO, we survey our members and we ask them all sorts of questions about security in their organization, what it's like to be a leader in the security industry, and the challenges and opportunities they face. What we have found is that for the 3rd year in a row, in 2021, our membership was saying that security culture was the #1 hot topic. By hot topic, we mean, what are you really looking at for the year ahead? Now, in 2021, for the first time, it tied with cloud. And when we think about the year that the cloud had from 2020 to 2021, I think that speaks volumes. The fact that security leaders are saying security culture is a burning issue for them. And this is because people are starting to understand more and more that your security culture defines your security posture. It really informs the extent to which you will have insider activity, whether malicious or accidental. It certainly defines the extent to which you will hear about it, so incident report rating. It defines the extent to which people come to you with questions, with concerns, with incidents, the extent to which you have your developers working with your security team. Your security culture defines your security posture. But still, we're in a position where people don't necessarily know, what do we mean by security culture? And I still hear people saying, well, it's just pink and fluffy, isn't it? It's just this thing, like it's intangible. What is culture? Well, we can answer that because there's been an awful lot of work done on organizational culture. One thing I think we could do as an industry to really propel us further forward is draw more on the work from other fields that is relevant to us. And one of those would be around organizational culture. So I really like the work of Professor Edgar Schein at MIT, who talks about and is one of the founding fathers in organizational culture. And Professor Schein defines culture as the values and the beliefs that underpin the norms of expected behaviors that people may follow. So culture isn't security awareness. Culture isn't security behavior. They are tied, of course, but culture is bigger than that. And culture is what emerges from the values and beliefs that underpin people's behaviors. So we can't just look at the behaviors. We can't just look at awareness. We have to look at where that's coming from. What is it that people believe in an organization? What do they believe is right about security? What do they believe is acceptable? That's really what leads to the culture of an organization. And we can look at it, we can examine it, we can assess it. That's one thing we do at Cygenta. And we do that by looking at different layers of culture. The top layer is the artifacts, or what Schein calls artifacts. I like to think of them as symbols. So basically, that will be, from an organizational perspective, that will be branding. That will be the logo. That will be the colors associated with that organization. Highly observable. You can see them. They're there to be seen. But that's really how an organization wants their culture to appear. It's not what their culture is, it's what they are aspiring to. It may be aligned with the culture, or it may not. Then we have a layer down, which would be the values, the espoused values. So what the company says its culture is, what it says its mission is, how it says it treats people. They are written down so we can observe them, we can read them, we can take them in. But of course, I'm sure many of us can think of examples of organizations that say they have a particular mission, say they have particular values, don't necessarily align when you get under the hood. So it's interesting to look at, but it doesn't tell us everything. What we have beneath that is what really makes up culture. And they are the underlying assumptions, how things are when nobody's looking. So when it comes to security, we can apply that model. And we can understand that the artifacts or the symbols are things like the security branding, are things like the training, the materials that are put out, the communications that are put out. Again, this is kind of what the security team wants the culture to be. Likewise with the security policy, the guidelines, the things that are written down, maybe the security culture strategy, if there is one. These are all good to tell us a bit about an organization's security culture, but what we really need to get to is the values, the perceptions, the assumptions that are lying beneath that. And you get to those with conversations. You can use surveys, they can help a little bit, but they'll tell you more about the superficial layers. It is listening to people throughout an organization to understand how they feel about security that will really tell you what the security culture is. It will tell you what their concerns are, what the perceptions of the security team are, what they're worried about, what concerns them, to what extent they understand the threats, to what extent they think leadership cares about security. This is what makes up the culture. And I've represented it with the post-it notes because there's nothing really visual that represents it other than the behaviors that come out of those perceptions and those assumptions. And a classic behavior might be writing down passwords on post-it notes because that comes from an assumption that actually productivity is more important. We're not given the tools like a password manager to manage passwords, etc. So how do you build a positive security culture? How do we actually get people engaged in security? I think this is a burning question for our profession. And again, we can look to other fields to give us the answer. We don't have to come up with the answers ourselves. It's already been done for us. And really what we need to look at is how we define context and how we frame our messaging, because that's what we need to give people. By context, I mean the why, and by framing, I mean the why me. So if we want people to listen to our messaging, we can't just tell them cybersecurity matters, have decent passwords, use a password manager, set up 2FA. How long have we been doing that? It doesn't work. We need to define the context and we need to frame the messaging. We need to tell them why and why you. And we need to think about fear when it comes to that, because we all know that FUD doesn't work, yet how many people are still using FUD because they don't know what else to do? Why does FUD not work? I'm going to come to that in a second, but to get to that, we need to take on board this fact, again, from behavioral economics. People show a disproportionate fear of risks that seem unfamiliar and out of control. That's why more people are scared of flying in an aeroplane than driving in a car. We all know, again, the stats tell us it is more safe to fly in an aeroplane than drive in a car. More accidents happen on the road than in the skies. Yet more people are scared of flying because it seems unfamiliar and out of our control. If we're driving, we're in the driving seat, so we feel more comfortable with that. When we get in a plane, for most of us, we're handing over control to the pilot. And we don't know, again, a lot of us don't know enough or as much about flying in a plane as we do about a car. And so it's the same when it comes to cybersecurity for a lot of people. For people who are not in this industry, this is a field that seems unfamiliar. And I think it's fair to say it seems out of control. We saw that in Mike's presentation earlier when he had that slide with all of the incidents from last year. People are aware of this context. They see this hitting the headlines on a daily basis. And for them, we talk in a language, I think it was Mandeep who said it, or maybe it was Stephen who said, you know, we use all these acronyms. We talk in this language that for a lot of people is off-putting. It makes this subject seem even more unfamiliar to them. The answer that we have had as a profession for a bit too long is, okay, we want to engage people, let's scare them. We've done that either consciously or just because it's what everyone does. But I've had a lot of clients come to me and say, hey Jess, we want to do an awareness program. We really need to get people involved. We need to scare them into taking this seriously. So then we have to have a conversation about the psychology of fear. I first presented on this at, actually, it was in Manchester. It was B-Sides Manchester about 7 or 8 years ago. And I gave a presentation on fear and loathing in cybersecurity. I gave a similar presentation, updated, as a keynote at RSA in 2020, I think. Who can keep track of time? So if you're interested in this, please do check out that keynote. I go into much more detail about the psychology of fear and cybersecurity. It's on the Cygenta YouTube channel. But essentially, we know from decades of research in psychology that if you go heavy on the fear and light on the interventions, if you just try and scare people into listening to a message that's aimed at changing their behavior, it does not work. Not only does it not work, it usually backfires. Usually people end up just trying to control the fear, the emotional response. So when you tell them all these stats about the latest cyber attacks, when you tell them log4j, the sky's going to fall in, people just switch off. You've seen it. Their eyes glaze over. They think, oh, they're just trying to hype this. They're just trying to scare me. They're just trying to justify their existence as security. And then when the sky doesn't fall in, because we work really hard and we try and fix as much as we can, it reinforces to them that we are the department of the boy who cried wolf. So people will just engage in the emotional response. They will just try and hide from what we're saying. What we need to do instead, of course, we acknowledge the threat, but we need to focus on self-efficacy. By which I mean we need to be empowering people to engage in this issue, and we need to be helping them with the tools that can manage the risk. When we do that, when we make people feel that they are capable of managing their cybersecurity, then they engage with the danger, and they will actually start practicing the behaviors that we want. So what we need to do essentially is move to the positive. Accentuate the positive. And again, decades of research in psychology and behavioral economics reinforces this. When people hear a negative message, they switch off. We are wired biologically to positive messaging. We get that dopamine hit from positivity that reinforces our behavior that we just don't get from a negative message. So actually telling people constantly how bad security is, well then why would they engage with us? It's really common sense, but it is backed up by the research. For example, about a decade or so of research in neuroscience teaches us that 80% of people around the world are wired towards optimism in our personal lives. So we kind of look at the world and we think the world is getting worse, politics is getting worse, etc. But most of us, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, regardless of any other demographic factor, geography, 80% of us are wired towards optimism. This is why we think we will never get divorced, we will never get sick, we will never get hacked. Because we just don't want to think it'll happen to us. And it's really not evolutionary sensible for us to be wired towards pessimism. If it was, then we wouldn't take risks, we wouldn't live our lives to the full. So we're wired towards optimism. Why does that matter in security? Look at security messaging with that in mind. Most of our messaging generally is negative. And what it means is people switch off. We wonder why people don't listen to us. They don't listen to us because they just think, well, this isn't going to apply to me. Why would hackers want my data? How many times has someone been confronted with that question? Yeah, I get it almost every day. So we need instead to frame our messaging to be more optimistic. How do you do that in security? Once you start, it actually becomes quite simple. And again, I've done a couple of keynotes on this. So almost as an opposite to, I enjoyed Mike's presentation, but almost as an opposite to his presentation, I've done presentations and keynotes in the past on why we should be optimistic about cybersecurity. And one of the reasons is it just engages people more. And if we want to engage people and we want behavioral change, we need to embrace that. As part of that, it's about looking at the language that we use. So I said earlier about rallying against this idea that people are the weakest link. I thought we'd left that phrase behind, actually, so I'm obviously a little bit out of touch in my people-centric bubble. One of the reasons I don't like this phrase, people are the weakest link, is that it's off-putting. Think about it. Have you ever been in that situation where you go to dinner, or you're in a bar, or you're trying to buy something, and the person you're engaging with, you get the sense that they think you're stupid? Has anyone ever had that feeling before? Because I know I have. And what does it do? I'm not going to engage with that person. I'm not going to buy this thing from them or listen to them if they're going to talk to me like I'm stupid. It's the same thing. If we keep calling people stupid, if we keep telling them that they're the problem, again, like psychological research going back 50 or 60 years shows us that people just switch off from that. What people respond to is when we build them up, is when we help them, is when we give them a sense of confidence and empowerment. So that applies to this phrase, people are the weakest link. You'll notice I'm using the word people, not users. Occasionally, you kind of have to call people an end user. Very, 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 very occasionally. 99% of the time, when we use the phrase user, see if you can just replace it with person or people, because you usually will be able to, and it'll still make more sense, to be honest. The phrase user, again, it's negative, and it's dehumanizing. User generally, widely, is used in a negative sense. So again, I think it's something we can move away from. And this idea of people as repeat offenders. A common question I'm asked when it comes to awareness, behavior, and culture, how do we deal with our repeat offenders? Well, stop calling them repeat offenders. Google the phrase repeat offender, and you will see loads of news articles about murderers, about violent criminals, and yet we use this phrase to talk about our colleagues. So again, I did a Black Hat keynote on that at the end of last year. It's on YouTube, check it out. My message from this, what I want you to take away, is how can we use a more positive language that doesn't alienate, language that doesn't imply an us and them. In sociology called in-groups and out-groups. When we build up this us and them narrative, like we're not users, it just puts people off. It makes them think that we think we're elitist, that we think we're better with our acronyms, etc. So how can we be more inclusive? How can we empower people? How can we enable people? How can we energize people to engage more in security? Because when we do that, we really truly build people up to be the strongest link. And one way I find really effective is champions programs. Happy to talk about that to anyone who wants to, maybe over coffee later today, because they're really interesting programs, a way of getting people throughout an organization empowered and engaged in cybersecurity. Why do it? Why should we focus on people? Why should we focus on culture? It is because truly a mature cybersecurity culture eats breaches for breakfast. It's what everything else is built on. There's no point having the tools and the technology if you're not thinking about people first. So, in summary, people are central, of course, to every element of cybersecurity. Social engineering works because it subverts trust and it exploits human bias that we all have. We need to draw positivity out of a field that has been historically negative and build self-efficacy of those around us. If we want to engage people, that's really important. And we do that with context, why, and framing. Why me? Why does this matter to me? And if we do that, what we get is more engagement and positive behavioral change. And this is important because security culture is an organization's security posture. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I'm around all day, so happy to chat.